Well, the case of an ostrich farm in southeast BC has drawn national, even international attention as federal officials attempt to enforce a cull of the nearly 400 ostriches still at this farm. Now, this follows just under 70 cases of avian influenza back in December of last year. This week, though, the Supreme Court of Canada has granted a stay so that cull won't proceed, at least not just yet. So, joining us for some further analysis of this whole situation, someone who's watching it unfold, very pleased to welcome to the program here Camille Labchuk, who is a lawyer, executive director with Animal Justice, animaljustice.ca. Camille, thank you so much for joining us here.
It's great to be here, Rob.
So, I guess the significance here of the Supreme Court intervention, if we can call it that, we don't know how ultimately they might decide on this case, but just the fact that they heard this, they issued a stay, what do we read into that?
Well, let's talk about some legal drama. That was an 11th hour decision, staying the execution of those ostriches, the likes of which I have not personally seen before. Honestly, animal law cases rarely make it to the Supreme Court, and certainly not in this sort of emergency fashion. So it was very, very interesting to watch. Ultimately, what the Supreme Court said is what was consistent with what the Federal Court of Appeal and also the Federal Court have both done, which was grant a stay of proceedings or a stay of the order of execution while they fully consider the case. Now, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. The case has to be fully briefed with written materials filed and arguments from counsel. And if the birds were killed and the order was executed before that occurred, that would just not be fair to the birds or the parties. So the Supreme Court's essentially saying the same thing. They're saying, let's put a pause on this for now. But they are saying as well that they do want to hear this case very quickly. I believe the parties have been ordered to have all their materials filed within about a week. And it seems like the Supreme Court will decide it on an expedited, more quick basis.
How important is it then that we get some legal clarity, not just with the specifics of this case, but how the CFIA can proceed in other cases? Because look, clearly there's concern about the impact of avian flu, but that's not a blank check for the CFIA either.
Well, the Health of Animals Act, which is the statute under which the CFIA is operating, it does grant that agency very broad discretion. And they are empowered to take various steps that they see fit to respond to avian influenza as a threat in ways that they decide are appropriate. That doesn't mean that everybody else gets to agree with the ways that they decide are appropriate, but it does empower them to make a lot of decisions. And the courts typically are loath to step in and intrude upon that jurisdiction and review CFI decisions. So that's what we saw the federal court say. That's what we saw the Federal Court of Appeal say. I do think it's important that this is litigated. I think it's important that this case has reached the public consciousness and reminded people that there are actually lives at stake here. This is not just some academic exercise about the CFIA making decisions, but there are individual animals whose lives hang in the balance. I can tell you there have been millions of chickens and turkeys and other birds who've already been culled by the CFIA over the past couple of years because of bird flu, and their lives didn't attract the same degree of attention. So I think it's a really good thing that we are having this conversation now about the ostriches, because the CFIA, I can guarantee you, will be engaging in similar steps in other bird flu cases when they do break out.
Right. And maybe it's the fact that it's ostriches in this case. Maybe that's one of the reasons why this has resonated with people. But I think there's just also the fact that it feels heavy handed. This was a situation that goes back to late last year. Here we are now, what 9 months later. And the idea that, these 400 birds need to die. I mean, I think it's left some people wondering whether this is going a little bit too far. What do you make of that?
I think it's raising a lot of questions for people for sure. And you're right. The fact that ostriches are massive, big birds with obvious personalities, obvious sentience and intelligence, I think that's why they've connected with people more than a barn full of chickens typically does. But whatever the reason be, people are now asking these questions. So birds, as you mentioned in the intro, they were infected back in December. We've got to assume at this point that whatever infections they've had have cleared up. The CFIA said in court documents that retesting the birds and doing further examinations is against their policies. But to me, that actually seems absurd. What is the point of killing these birds 9 months later? It seems to me like it's justified over jurisdiction. And I don't see why birds should have to suffer and die. And make no mistake, they will suffer as they die. It's very difficult to kill animals humanely. No matter which animals they are, how they're being treated. It's difficult to carry out an extermination on that scale, especially when the animals don't want to die. So the fact that birds should have to suffer and die just so the CFIA can prove a point about its jurisdiction, to me, doesn't seem right.
No, and further to that, I mean, the word cull just sounds so innocuous, but there is a process here. And I know there's been some concern raised about how this is done or to whom the CFIA is reaching out to do this on their behalf. And especially with animals like ostriches, what do people need to know about what would go into this?
Yeah, you're right. They do use very sanitary language like cull or depopulation to describe what they plan to do to the birds, but it's exterminating them. And it's often pretty brutal. So, Animal Justice actually did a pretty large access to information investigation into previous bird culls associated with avian influenza. And we got thousands of pages of government documents over the past couple years. And what we found was the CFIA using just appalling methods to kill birds. They gassed chickens and turkeys in homemade gas chambers that didn't function very effectively. They attempted to use a nitrogen based foam to suffocate birds. They did a test on that. It didn't work very well. The birds were still alive for the most part, and they obviously suffered. And we just saw really, really other unfortunate methods. So I don't have a lot of trust in the CFIA to carry out this quote unquote cull humanely. We also saw that they engaged a company named Elite Farm Services. Elite had previously been convicted for animal cruelty for abusing chickens. The CFIA prosecuted them in the past for chicken abuse during transport. So the fact that they would then be looking to this company to help them carry out depopulations or culls of birds to me is really troubling. So I don't have a lot of trust in the CFIA's ability to do this in a way that doesn't cause quite a lot of suffering to these ostriches.
Right. The idea about allowing testing, and the CFIA seems pretty against that, but that almost seems like a reasonable compromise here because I don't think anyone really wants to see avian flu running amok. Does that seem like a reasonable course of action at this point? Could that be done?
It does seem like it could be done, and it's been really surprising to me that the CFIA hasn't addressed that publicly. I think their communication strategy on this has been about as bad as the rest of their strategy on it, but we haven't heard a response from them about that. I know the ostrich farm has tried to adduce new evidence into the case to show that the birds are doing well now, and the courts haven't so far allowed that evidence to be in there. So I feel like we're operating in a deficit of information, and that if we simply could get into a better place with more information, the CFA could potentially make a better decision. To be honest with you, Rob, I thought that this whole time when the CFA was defending against this case, that what they were doing sort of made sense because they had to defend their jurisdiction. They wanted to protect their ability to carry out calls if they deemed them necessary. But I never thought that they would win and then still decide to kill the birds because of the passage of time. So it really does feel at this point like they're just trying to make a point.
Right. And not every call can or should go to the Supreme Court of Canada, clearly. But what do you hope can come of this then? And maybe at least clarifying the CFA's powers here, the situations where they need to intervene or should maybe not intervene.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely they need to revise whatever policy they've got on the books that says that they're not going to bother retesting birds. If the circumstances change, then the policies and their procedures should change as well. That seems really obvious to me, and I think it seems really obvious to anyone that's watching this case, which is that there's no point in killing healthy birds. It really feels like they're punishing the birds just because they survived this horrible sickness. So, what is the point there? I also just think it's a really good time to be having a broader conversation about bird flu and the factory farming system. We have to remember that the reason the CFIA is so hell bent on exterminating these birds in the first place is because they're given the mandate to protect factory farming from disease outbreaks. Factory farming, I think, is something that most of us don't support when we start to hear the details about it, but it involves cramming hundreds of thousands sometimes of birds into tiny sheds where they don't get to see sunlight, they don't get to experience anything natural, and their lives are miserable and short. So, if that's the system that we're protecting by carrying out this ostrich kill, I hope that starts, having people raise questions in their mind about why we're doing this.
Right. Yeah, because this farm in BC certainly wouldn't meet that description. This is kind of the opposite of factory farming.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the ostriches have outdoor access, which is good. I want to be clear, the ostrich farm has killed birds in the past. It's not that they're not exploiting them or using them for profit. They've been, I think, a little less than clear in the court documents about the uses for which the birds are being put. But, when you look at these 400 incredible sentient intelligent birds, should they have to die just because the CFA wants to protect their jurisdiction? I think most people would say no.
And should that factor in, what they're processing and what they're going through, even this whole situation with these crowds and these drones and everything else, does the CFIA need to take that into consideration, do you think?
Well, they certainly should be. I've been really troubled. I've been checking out some of the live streams from the ostrich farm, and I've seen low flying drones. It seems like the government agencies were flying drones over the ostriches for some purpose. What that is, I don't know. And it seems like that did spook the birds. Obviously, the birds are experiencing at this point potentially dozens of unfamiliar people in their habitat where they live. You've got to imagine that's stressful for them. It seems like really just a very intense, busy situation that can't be good for the birds. I think when you consider how these are massive, massive birds. It's really hard to kill an animal humanely. I will say, even in the
Yeah.
slaughterhouse where they try to introduce regulations to make that happen, a lot of the time animals still suffer significantly. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is because animals don't want to die. They want to live, they want to protect their lives. These ostriches are like any other animal, and that's compounded by the fact that they're so big. So you think about how you could actually possibly capture an ostrich, kill that bird humanely without causing a lot of suffering, it becomes a real, real problem. So the situation on the ground right now for the farm I see is very troubling.
Right. And I mean, ultimately, I suppose the CFIA would argue that they're trying to prevent more of this down the road. If there were no avian flu, then they wouldn't have to do any of this. So we understand why there's a mandate to try to get ahead of this situation. We don't want this to get out of hand. We certainly don't want to see, spill over to the human population. But is there a better balance that could be found here?
Yeah, and there are some infectious disease experts, veterinary infectious disease experts, who have also pointed out that at this point, avian flu is endemic. It's not that we're going to be able to stop it from spreading amongst wild populations of birds. We just can't do that. The
Right.
cat or bird is out of the bag, so to speak. So, is there really any value to killing these birds who have likely recovered from avian influenza? I think the answer is just clearly no.
Yeah. We'll see what comes of this case. Much more, as mentioned, animaljustice.ca. Camille, appreciate your perspective and insight on this. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Glad to be here.
Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.